The shadow collector, Detective Ellie Collins, had always trusted her instincts. 15 years with the NYPD's Homicide Division had taught her that coincidences were usually breadcrumbs leading to darker truths. But nothing in her career had prepared her for the horror that began on that rainy October evening in Lower Manhattan. The old brick buildings disappeared into the fog, while yellow streetlights created grotesque shadows on the wet asphalt. Ellie stood over the body of a young woman in the alley, studying the killer's signature, the same precise cuts, the same surgical accuracy, and again, no DNA evidence. "That's the fourth one," she said to her partner, Mike Rodriguez, who was struggling to keep his coffee down. "And every murder follows the exact pattern of Jack the Ripper. Even the wound placement is identical." "Just another copycat," Mike shrugged, his weathered face looking older in the harsh crime scene lights. "They pop up every few years. Some sicko with a history fetish." But Ellie knew this was different. In the police archives, she'd found similar unsolved cases dated 1988, 1958, 1928. Every 30 years, the same signature, the same inexplicable details. And always those strange shadows in the crime scene photos, too dark, too wrong, defying the laws of physics. The breakthrough came when she visited the Museum of Criminal History, where she met Dr. David Parker, an expert on historical serial killers. His office was a Victorian time capsule, filled with artifacts and aged police photographs. The shadows in the old pictures seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. "You've noticed the shadows, haven't you?" he asked, studying her face intently. "They appear in all the photographs, starting with the original London murders." He pulled out an ancient leather journal. This belonged to Detective Preston, who investigated the Ripper case in 1888. Read his final entry. Ellie opened the yellowed pages. "It's not human. I followed it into the shadows. What I saw, God help us all, it feeds on their fear before death. And now it knows I've seen it." "What happened to Preston?" she asked, though something in her gut already knew the answer. "Vanished. Like everyone else, who's gotten too close to the truth." That night, alone in her office, Ellie studied the old photographs. The shadows moved. At first, she blamed it on fatigue, but then the shadows began forming a figure. A tall silhouette in a top hat and cloak. But something was wrong with its proportions, wrong in a way that made her eyes hurt. The temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath became visible in the air. "Fear," whispered a voice from the darkness. "Fear makes the meat sweeter." Ellie turned slowly. The shadow on the wall had gained depth, stepped into reality, a creature of living darkness that only vaguely resembled a human form. "They never caught me," it said, in a voice that made her blood freeze. "Because I was never human to begin with." She ran for the door, but the shadows ahead moved independently, trying to grab her. In the hallway, she collided with Dr. Parker. His eyes were pitch black. "I warned you, Detective." He smiled with too many sharp teeth. "We've kept this secret for generations. We feed it, sustain it, and in return, it shares its power." Other figures emerged from the shadows, a cult of shadow people, servants of an ancient evil. "Join us, Ellie." Parker's voice had changed, becoming older, deeper. "You've seen too much to go back now, but you can be part of something eternal." The shadows reached for her with elongated fingers. In desperation, Ellie drew her gun and shot the fire alarm. Emergency lights flooded the corridor. The shadows recoiled with an inhuman screech. She ran into the street, knowing she was marked. The entity known as Jack the Ripper would hunt her now. But she had a purpose, to expose the truth, to show the world that behind all these murders stood something ancient and hungry, a creature of shadows that fed on human fear. On the roof of the adjacent building, a dark figure in a top hat watched her flee. The hunt had begun again. After all, it had eternity to play with its prey and fear. Fear always made the meat sweeter. In her apartment, Ellie barricaded the windows and began to write. To whoever finds this, the truth about Jack the Ripper. It wasn't one killer. It wasn't even human. She worked through the night, documenting everything she'd discovered. The 30-year cycle, the shadow cult, the thing that had been feeding on human fear since before London's gas-lit streets ran red with blood. As dawn approached, she noticed the shadows in her apartment growing deeper, moving against the light. Her computer screen reflected something standing behind her, a tall figure in Victorian clothes, but its proportions were wrong, its movements jerky and inhuman. "Clever girl," it whispered, its voice containing echoes of every scream it had ever harvested. "But knowledge won't save you. It never saved any of them." Ellie didn't turn around. Instead, she hit send on the email containing all her evidence, addressed to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency. "Maybe not," she said, finally facing the creature, "but the world deserves to know what's hunting in the shadows." The thing that called itself Jack laughed, a sound like breaking glass and tearing flesh. "And you think they'll believe you? Humans see what they want to see. They'll call it a hoax, a conspiracy theory. And meanwhile..." Its form expanded, darkness filling the room. "Meanwhile, I'll keep feeding. And you, dear Ellie, will help me. Your fear is exquisite. The fear of someone who knows exactly what's coming." Outside her window, the sun was rising over New York City. But Ellie knew the shadows would always be there, waiting, hungry. And somewhere in those shadows, a creature in a top hat would continue its eternal hunt, wearing humanity like a mask while it fed on their darkest fears. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. And in the years that followed, people would sometimes spot a female detective walking the night streets of Manhattan, warning others to stay out of the shadows. But if you looked closely, her movements weren't quite right and her smile contained too many sharp teeth. After all, fear makes the meat sweeter, and no one knows fear better than those who have become what they once hunted.